Hello, everyone. Welcome to a spooky edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. It's October 31st. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. Spooky for two reasons. I'm not wearing my hat today, so it's bald Rich. And Cyrus has some risk we need to talk about, the migration plan of what the next couple weeks of our lives will look like. Some frights in there. It's also some excitement, so it's worth sticking around for. I want to talk a bit about what's been happening in the governance ecosystem as well before we get into the meat of that. And afterwards, we'll be hearing from LongForWisdom as he gives us a recap of what's been going on in the forums in his governance at a glance recap. First, the preambles. We desperately want to hear from everybody in this room. There's lots of strong opinions, lots of deep insight that we need to get access to. So if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to type it into the chat at the side. If you have access to a microphone, feel free to use that as well. And just jump on the mic and ask away. I am going to kick things off, though. I'll try to keep it short because we have some important things to go over with the risk migration doc. In the governance world, actually, I might be stepping on LongForWisdom's toes, but I'll do it anyways. It's my prerogative. So we had a debt ceiling vote that went in, which was largely shepherded from by LongForWisdom over the course of months, it seems. Which led to a poll being put into the system. The contents of that poll stated that if the debt ceiling, if the amount of circulating DAI came within 10 million of the stipulated debt ceiling at any point, even for a block, then the plan is to add another 10 million buffer to the debt ceiling and initiate an executive. And this is very interesting for a bunch of reasons. It's another good example of the community coming together, figuring out that there's an issue that needs to be solved, figuring out what the solution to that issue is, creating a proposal around that issue, and then having it end up in the governance portal. So that's enormously exciting to me. The other interesting thing here is this is the first time that we've seen a process that allows for or requires an executive vote to be created that without having to move through a polling stage first. So this is sort of a human-based algorithmic response to the lack of depth in our debt ceiling, I suppose, which is something that needs to be internalized because that's a very cool behavior, potentially very scary behavior. So we have experts, we have actors in this ecosystem that have been empowered to perform certain tasks. And I see that Nick is joining the call. He's an example of one of them, the head of Oracles and the representative of the interim Oracle team, I believe we're calling it. I'm the interim governance facilitator. Cyrus and his team are the interim risk teams. These are, as discussed previously, we are the prototypes for these roles. And the reason why we exist in these prototypical roles is because we need to create a baseline which allows the community to take over these roles and in the mid to short to midterm, join us in these positions, and then potentially in the long term replace us in these positions. And so as the foundation eventually winds itself down to other tasks. So these are all very, very interesting behaviors. And so I encourage people to join the discussions in the forums where we sort of hammer through some of these philosophical aspects of what on-chain governance looks like for MakerDAO. Moving along, the next thing I want to talk about is as governance becomes more sophisticated, we have this sort of a race condition with the complexity of the governance portal. So we're determining requirements of what we need from this system, and as the system becomes busier and more complex, we're seeing more cracks might be forming in the governance portal and the voting system that we have designed. One of those cracks surfaced, and it wasn't like a surprise, I don't think, to anybody, but the crack is this. In order for a poll to get pushed into the system, there's a significant amount of administration that needs to be done. Content needs to be written, light math needs to be performed, markdown files need to be posted here, there, and other places, and then a poll gets queued up sits in a tool, and then when the timer goes off, that poll shows up on chain. The problem with this system is that we have two mechanisms. We have polls, which are time-bound, and we have executives, which are open-ended. The problem is that occasionally an executive will come along that will determine the contents of a poll. So here's the sophisticated solution to this problem. Polls go out, let's use PST time, because let's face it, that's the center of the universe. Pretend I didn't say that. I post a poll at around 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, hoping that that minimizes the amount of time that somebody will come in and cast a pile of, or stake a pile of Maker to ratify an executive. So that's about 8 hours between when this thing goes into the system and a poll shows up on the site. So like I said, that creates an 8-hour window between what the executive was that the poll was based on and what the poll going live. What happened last weekend was my worst nightmares realized. This is sticking with the spooky theme. Somebody between 10 p.m. PST, whatever, Sunday and Monday morning came in and staked a lot of Maker, and that changed what the executive was. So we are in a position this week where we have a poll that reflects a range of numbers and an executive that was stale. So that's why the minimum stability fee for this week is 5.5, as well as the executive being a vote for 5.5. So, or the executive being 5.5. So there's some complexities there that we need to understand, and some solutions that need to be arrived at. So let's continue that discussion in the forums as well. See if we come up with some innovative solutions. My assumption is it's going to be technical and social. So let's figure out where those two things meet. I think the tool needs to be augmented a bit. Next major topic of conversation. This one's going to be spicy. There's been some discussion in crypto Twitter and various crypto news outlets about what plutocracies mean and how large actors behave in the MakerDAO ecosystem, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. And this is, it's an issue that we run into every once in a while, where as Maker becomes more well-known in the ecosystem, people who previously didn't pay a lot of close attention to it start to pay close attention to it, or at least enough attention to generate a hot take and then move on with their lives. And one of those hot takes, and this is sort of, it's an interesting behavior. Sorry, let me get my thoughts in order. One of these hot takes is that whales are controlling the MakerDAO ecosystem. And I try not to chuckle when I read those things, because here's something that we need to make sure that we've internalized, make sure that we're all happy with, and then make sure, and trying to think about ways we can communicate this externally, because this is my hot take. Actually, it's a pretty cool take. MakerDAO is a plutocracy. It was fundamentally designed to be a plutocracy from day one by the system architects. There's no surprises here. This is precisely how the system is designed to work. We have a Maker token. That Maker token is used for voting, and that Maker token is also used as a recapitalization resource in the event of all kinds of unpleasant activities in the system. It is the backstop for this ecosystem that we're all working in. So we have these stakeholders who have the most skin in the game, the presumption being that, like many other systems like this all over the world, these people with the most skin in the game have the most incentive to pay very close attention to how the system works and to effectively manage it in order to preserve their holdings. This shouldn't be a surprise. Where we run into some cognitive overhead is, or cognitive dissonance, sorry, I'm getting my cognitives mixed up, is that they come to the crypto with a lot of assumptions. Frequently some of these people are involved with this type of mechanism for the first time. And so that we have unsophisticated users. Maybe that that phrase will come back to bite me. But people see a voting system and naturally they think representative voting. And that's something that we need to work on, because this is not representative voting. This is skin in the game voting. It's not something that we invented, surprisingly. And don't tell anybody, but MakerDAO hasn't really invented a lot. We've just taken a lot of really cool pieces, or a lot of effective pieces out of the real world, mix them all together and put them on chain. And this is one of them. Shareholder voting should not come. The mechanisms behind something like that, which is not what we are, but the mechanism is the same, shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. So one of the things we need to work better, to do a better job on internally and externally, is explaining to the ecosystem that we are managed by our largest holders. And as this group and the forum, the group in the forum, the governance community, it's our responsibility to effectively lay down the groundwork, set the memes, provide direction, and give these larger holders a way to behave, or an understanding of how the system works, and allow them to come into the system and cast their votes in ways that are beneficial for everybody involved. Happily, we've seen that in the vast majority of the case. I don't know. I'm willing to be corrected that we've seen a hostile or an antagonistic vote. I'm not familiar with one. So here's the issue. It's not that we have whales voting in the system. Right now, our primary issue is we don't have enough whales voting in the system. We need to get more whales active, and there's a few different initiatives on the go in order to make that happen. So that's one thing that I wanted to address without going too deeply into things. Actually, no, I want to touch on one more thing. So we have whales, which is a pejorative term in this ecosystem, but it's precisely what they are, and precisely what we need. There's mechanisms available to the krills, and I can't remember the scale of aquatic life that goes underneath whales, but I am a krill, so I know what category I fall into. And so there's mechanisms, there's tools that krills can use to self-organize and to increase their votes and to make their votes count. And this is a refrain that I've been repeating for almost a year, and I'm going to continue to repeat it as long as I can. That if you, as a voter, if you think that your vote doesn't matter, it doesn't, because the system will be managed by people who believe their vote does matter and actually stake it. And that sounds obvious on the surface, difficult to prove in practice, but happily, sadly, I don't know, I'll leave it up to the community to decide. The perfect example of that happened just recently. We went from 9.5 stability fee to a 5.5 stability fee. And what did it take to move that ecosystem, our ecosystem, that drastically? Somebody can probably, I should have checked this beforehand, but 1,500 Maker, I think, something like that. It's ridiculously small, the stake that was put into the system to move basically DeFi. So it's a teaching moment, and I hope that we're absorbing that as a community, that if you don't vote, somebody is, and whoever is voting is in control of this ecosystem. So krills, it's time to self-organize. It's time to get out there. Mid-level holders, it would have taken 2, 3. There's so many mid-level holders that any tiny percentage of those people could have shifted these things. If assuming the 5.5 wasn't the correct move, I have no idea. I'm not smart enough to know that. But it doesn't take a lot to move the system, and if people take their hands off the wheel, whoever's left on that bus is going to be in charge. So let's try and change this narrative about how we've turned into a dirty plutocracy. The fact that we're a plutocracy shows that the system works as designed. And so if the community decides that that's not the world we want to live in, then we can change it, I guess, over the course of the next year or whatever it takes to change something like that. But in the meantime, the solution here is we need more whales, and we need more holders to come out and balance out those whales. So that's my speechifying for today. Does anybody, were there any questions, or is it just?
Rich, this is Patrick the Quarry. So I'm new here, so I'll just do a quick thing. I've been listening to these calls for a month. I'm very impressed with everything that's going on. I mean, just listening and learning. But I mean, I sort of, this week was the first time that I noticed something. And I think, like you said, spot on. The problem is not the plutocracy. It's how little it took. That one sort of one account that sort of was able to change so much. And by the way, I've seen a lot of impressive things that, you know, I don't want to, like, you know, that I'll type them somewhere else, you know, because I don't want to just say negative things the one time I speak. But if we could, here's what I was thinking. So here's the solution I was thinking. We want, and we've talked about this before, where we want to increase user engagement. We want to increase more votes, and this wouldn't have happened. As it stands, we have it like there's a moral hazard where a single person or entity can manipulate markets if they can move interest rates that much. That's my concern. Then I did a little bit of analysis of maker holders and what they risk. Their risk only comes in an emergency shutdown. So, you know, that's about $400 million out there. They're gonna lose 25%. But that only happens if maker doesn't hold, if the dollar peg moves, so, you know, just disappears and goes low. Is it easier? Is there a way to hold maker holders like myself responsible and reward us more for keeping it close as possible to the peg and punish us if we move the value of the guy?
Yeah, I think that there probably is. Whenever we have these discussions, wherever I take the universe to task about apathy and the way that our system is designed, the immediate response is, well, how do we incentivize? How do we reward and or punish people for properly and or improperly managing the system? It's there seems to be two primary suggestions for that. One is we just simply create some kind of a reward for participating in the voting ecosystem. And I think I've been fairly vocal in my firm belief that nobody has ever come up with an incentivization mechanism to participate in a voting system that hasn't been immediately exploited for gain. The second suggestion is, how do we reward and or punish specific holders for the quality of their governance? And I think that there is possibly room. That makes sense, because that can be managed, that can be quantified, it can be tracked. The problems that I see in that system is, A, designing it effectively. It's not a simple thing to do. And B, determining whether the additional friction that would be imposed wouldn't eliminate any kind of benefit. So here's my question to the community. Right now we have an ecosystem that or a voting infrastructure that allows people to have their say based on how much maker they have. Here's how you do it. You go to a website, you read something, you click 2 buttons, and then boom, you're done. So that's the level of friction that we've imposed into this ecosystem. And we've seen recently, for whatever reason, DevCon, who knows, but we've gone from like 2% participation from the outstanding maker to 0.2. So we've lost an order of magnitude here. And the friction that we're presenting to the ecosystem is click 2 buttons. So what happens if we present a system that's, okay, we need you to understand this bonding curve, we need you to understand the slashing mechanism, we need you to stake and lock, we need you to have a vesting period or on your, like, there's all kinds of stuff. So I think that it's worth exploring. I don't know that I've seen a rock solid proposal about how that would work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking more along, you know, the $5 million fund that we have right now that's supposed to be burned, that's from the fees. Like, if we put that at stake, if they goes too much above 1 or too much below 1, and if it stays at 1, we somehow can put more money in there. In other words, we burn more day. Then you know, because I think we should incentivize people for keeping a peg, not just for paying if things go to hell. I think we can do one better.
I think there's a lot of good discussions to be had there. And it sounds like you've given us some thought. So here's, let me give you an action item. Let's go into the forums and let's start a thread there. Like, how do we incentivize, how do we reward good management of the system? I would love to start collecting, because we've been having these conversations, well, as long as I've been here, and I can guarantee long before I showed up. So like, the last 2 years, maybe I'm not going to throw a number at it, but a lot of conversations about how do we incentivize people in a way that makes sense. Do we reward the risk teams for making a good call? Do we reward and or slash the maker holders for directly making a mistake in their decision-making process? Do we try to pay somebody $5 to vote? Like there's been a whole range of sophisticated to very simplistic decision ideas. So if we can get a thread going in the forums where we start collecting this stuff, that's the beginning to the process. That's how we've run into a point where the debt ceiling just got changed, because it has to start with a forum thread. Somebody has to write these ideas down. We have to debate them, and then we have to turn it into a proposal. Like otherwise, we're just spitballing, I think. So can I count on you, Patrick, to spend a couple hours writing out a forum thread for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go and learn how to do the markup languages that I have to do it in. Yeah.
Oh, there's an editor. It's easy. I'm half kidding though, but if we can get that conversation started in a way that has a long tail, it's not going to go away like a chat in Rocket, but something that sticks around for weeks and or months in a forum, we can actually get some movement behind this. I would love to have we've even had some fairly weighty proposals in our subreddit that have been, promptly and ignored, but worthy of review. So maybe we can dig out some of those things too and add those to the forums. I'm about out of time though. Is my segments over? Can I talk about why polls can't be edited after they go live? Because they stuck on the chain. It's immutable, son. Is that what you're asking me, Cyrus? Why can't they be edited?
Yeah, but I mean, what does that mean? They're stuck on the chain. I mean, I don't think people really know how that the governance polls are more than just text.
Oh, I see. I was making.
Why can't you just go in and just edit the options and then track the MKR votes or something?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do we have any of the developers involved with the polling mechanism? They can possibly chime in and stop me from exposing my own ignorance. The voting mechanism is a contract deployment, so it's a significant level of effort. The polling mechanism is emitting events on a contract that just simply show where Maker has been, or what events have been called in relation to the most recent poll. In order to avoid tomfoolery in this system, though, the wording of these polls is cryptographically signed when it goes on chain, and that maps back to a hash that's attached to a vote. So in order for us to go down that path, which is certainly possible, it's a dangerous path to go to, where we're like, here's something we all agreed on, here's a poll that just went up live, and something went wrong, so let's change that poll. We can't change the signed source of it. So we'd have to go in and modify the UI. We'd have to do a bunch of really kind of shady things, which feel a bit to me like rewriting history. I think if there's something wrong with a poll, well, it's certainly an option. It's not up to me. So we could either do that, or the second option being that we just immediately release another poll that has better options in it and encourage people to look at that one instead, which would allow us to keep sort of this chain of custody, or like this audit trail of what happened in the past without having people wonder whether we've edited things after the fact. It's like a shadow, ninja edit. Ninja editing the polls might be a strange thing to start doing.
We should have you could have like a poll option for like invalidate or something, so people can signal that they don't think the poll is still valid, and then that could let you know that they want another one. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. So we'd have to figure out what that mechanism looks like and how that would impact, and when. Yeah, so there's every question, these similar questions. What happens if it's like day number 4 of a 5-day poll, or what if people have voted and gone on their summer vacations and come back to find that their vote was invalidated because somebody else didn't like the wording of it? I don't know. This just leads to more and more questions. You know me, LongForWisdom. Every time you present a solution, I just ask you 15 more questions. So there you go.
That's all good. I used to it.
All right, I'm out of time. Cyrus, I'm going to hand this off to you. Can you please give us some insight into the migration doc?
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about risk, but first I actually wanted to highlight that we put out, the foundation put out a blog today about some new terminology. And actually I think CDPs are going to be renamed to Maker Vaults. The blog kind of explains the reasoning behind that, but TLDR, it's, I think, designed for better accessibility and more user friendliness to kind of the wider, just the wider community as we try to scale and grow the protocol. So I'm going to try something really annoying, and that is to use the word vault instead of CDP for the entirety of this talk about risk.
We'll have a swear jar. Every time you make a mistake, you have to put 50 die, half a die in a swear jar.
Yeah, and the thing is, the slides are created with CDPs written, so we'll see how that goes. But if it's too confusing, I'll just stick to CDPs today. But I think it's somewhat important that we at least try to start adopting the new terminology as soon as possible. All right. Give me 1 second. Right. So migration risk. Today we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the migration and what that's going to look like over the coming weeks. Just as a quick recap, two primary stakeholders, SCI holders and CDP owners, and I guess MKR holders is a third stakeholder. SCI holders can convert their DAI immediately using a special migration contract. A user would deposit their SCI into almost like a special CDP and borrow or draw new DAI against it. This new DAI, this CDP will have 0% stability fee. User is not expected to ever pay back this CDP, so they kind of just take their DAI and go on their merry way. And then afterwards, a CDP owner can come in and utilize that deposited SCI liquidity to migrate their vault from SCD to MCD. They'll of course have to pay off their MKR stability fee or governance fee first, and the migration UI will be able to handle that. Benefit of this migration contract is that it takes place outside of the public exchanges, public marketplace, so users won't have to be buying and selling DAI back and forth, incurring slippage, and that is also healthy for the DAI price as well. And then there's kind of a big thing about global settlement. It's not expected to occur anytime soon, but a few of the risks that I'll go over today require that this, at the very least, be an option on the table. So basically, the format of this is I'm just going to kind of run through the risks one by one, talk about why they're important, kind of talk about some potential mitigation plans, and then at the end, I'll kind of consolidate the various mitigation strategies into one overall plan. And also, I think this might appear that there are a lot of risks. I think there's 8 that I've highlighted in this presentation. Some of them are very easy fixes. Some of them are potentially require some more monitoring. So we'll touch upon that as well. Okay, so the first risk is that the migration occurs too slowly. This could happen for a number of reasons, but just mainly friction, right? Everybody knows how crypto works. It's slow. People are slow to do things, dig out their private keys. They don't follow the news every day, and so on. and this could be a problem because it's a lot of overhead for us as a community, for the foundation, for kind of just everybody involved with trying to keep Maker operating. But even above just extra workload for us, there could be fractured liquidity if some exchanges are in DAI, some are in Psi. Users don't really know what to do. It's just, it could be a mess, right? It could disrupt businesses in the DeFi ecosystem, and so on. I think the plan here is just to select logical, sane risk parameters across the board. That's kind of what we were highlighting in the last few weeks, is that we're just going to go with what makes sense from a safety conscious risk perspective. And I'll dive a little bit into what those specific parameters might be, I think, at the end. Any questions on this one? Or yeah, just people jump in with questions whenever they come up. Second risk, on the other hand, migration could occur too quickly, which is also a problem. This might occur if the parameters are too favorable. So for example, if we started the DSR with 10%, that could be a problem for a number of reasons. The main issue, I think, with migration occurring too quickly is that there's just some small level, not small, but there's a level of uncertainty with launching a whole new protocol. The end users want to be able to monitor the deployment. We want to make sure that things are operating smoothly. If any unforeseen issue were to come up, it would be more difficult to rectify it if there was just this massive migration underway in the first few days. And potentially it also, I think we have a desired order of operations, meaning that it's better for the Psi holders to be migrating before CDP owners, so that CDP owners can utilize the Psi liquidity from the migration contract. And so again, so we can prevent the migration from occurring too quickly with just risk parameters. So no super high DSR and super low stability fee, for example. I think that would be a mistake. Next risk. There's a bit of an issue with secondary lenders. It's not clear whether or not they can, or if they'll be able to build the functionality in time to utilize the migration contract. So for example, for CDP owners from Maker, it's going to just be a couple clicks and you're off. But a user who has borrowed DAI from Compound, for example, will likely not be able to just do a 2-click migration because they just have a whole different architecture, whole different setup. There's definitely, I mean, all of our ecosystem partners have migration plans underway to kind of make that experience as smooth and frictionless as possible for their users. Nonetheless, there isn't a clear way to get around the fact that roughly 30 million borrowed Psi from the secondary lending platforms needs to be paid back in order for those borrowers to migrate to MCD. And without the migration contract, that would entail them buying all that Psi on the open markets, which may or may not be an issue. And we'll talk about kind of more generalized Psi price deviations in some of the other slides. But essentially, if this does happen, market makers need to be able to facilitate this manual migration of CDPs, and a super important tool there is the debt ceiling, because, well, the way I think about it right now, there's a 90 million PSI outstanding, but then there's an additional 30 million of outstanding loans from the secondaries, and so roughly the debt ceiling will need to cover at the max the sum of those two numbers to be able to facilitate any migrations that would be flowing through Maker. I'm not sure if I explained that entirely clearly, but people kind of get that this might impact the side price, and need to make sure that debt ceiling is sufficient for market makers.
Actually, Cyrus, can you give us an example of how you'd envision the debt ceiling responding to these pressures? Like how would that look? Would it be raised? Like
Yeah, it would. It's not that it would be raised, but we want to make sure that there's always that buffer there. So if the side price were to increase due to secondary lenders closing out their outstanding positions, we would need to be able to expand the size supply.
So
But that being said, the overall supply can still be going down as the overall debt ceiling can be going down as the migration is underway. It's just that there needs to be a buffer between the current size supply and the max debt ceiling.
How do you envision figuring out what that buffer should be? Is it something that just we figure it out after migration starts? Like this is the thing that I have trouble wrapping my head around is this is a complete unknown for us. We don't know what a migration looks like because I'm reasonably sure nobody's tried it before. So is this a matter of us doing a gut check every couple of weeks, figuring out what a good buffer is for the next week? Or
I mean, I think the buffer is a function of that 30 million side that's outstanding.
Okay.
So
yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly 1-to-1, but I think just having 15 to 20 million room is probably all right to start with.
One thing I just wanted to say, guys, and it should be the community, and Cyrus made this point, but it's hammer at home. We are actively working with the secondary lenders to make sure this goes smoothly. So Cyrus has been on tons of calls with you name it, from DYDX to Compound. So just want to know, let the community know that we're trying to make sure it goes really well there.
Yeah, also just as a point of of the fact that we're going to be able to be very responsive to this is we don't need a governance poll, right? We just passed the governance poll to enact an executive the second we hit like that 10 million within that 10 million buffer. So we'll be able to very quickly respond if needed, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to derail things, but this talks about another flaw and/or feature of the governance ecosystem. This precise wording of that poll stipulated that it's only in effect until MCD launches. So we'd have to pass another one for post MCD. Just to put that out.
That's my bad, guys.
So on your permanent record, LongForWisdom, why did you not anticipate that we would launch MCD in the middle of your forum thread?
I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah, well, learning. All right.
Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, we are working closely with secondary lending platforms to ensure the migration goes as smoothly as possible. And I think as time goes on, this will significantly be de-risked because I know that there are probably several tools in development that would make this process easier over the coming weeks and months. So this is probably maybe just around a few weeks after launch where not everything may be up to speed on the infrastructure side. So just something we're gonna have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, Instadap obviously made the Compound V1
Right.
die bridge. Is there any chance of getting? I'm presumably they're working on a one for V2.
Yeah, they actually just released a blog post on it this morning, which I haven't had a chance to read. But in general, the Instadap I think, as far as I understand, incentive architectures may be slightly different and may not be generalizable to all compound users, but I could be wrong there. But yeah, good point. All right, next risk. There may not be at all times enough Psi liquidity in the migration contract. So Psi user migrates over, and then a CDP owner can repurpose that Psi for themselves, and then that liquidity is now gone. If more CDP owners want to migrate, then essentially that would be the same situation as a secondary borrower wanting to migrate, which is they'll have to do a manual migration, buy up Psi, repay their CDP, unlock their collateral, move it over, and reestablish their position, which might actually also impact DAI liquidity because then they have to resell their newly minted DAI. This is, I think that there's going to be plenty of Psi liquidity on in the early weeks. And then if by the time that dries out, I think the whole migration will have been significantly de-risked. But that being said, is something to watch out for as a risk. Probably want to make sure that the risk parameters are compatible between Psi holders and CDP owners. And by this, I mean that desired order of operations that I was referring to earlier, where Psi holders, I think we really want Psi holders to migrate at a pace slightly faster than CDP owners, which involves having the DSR versus the stability fee spread designed a certain way. I think this is more art than science to pick those parameters. And I also don't think it's a huge deal one way or another, but something to keep in mind.
Did you say CDP owners or vault owners?
Yeah, I realize I've been saying CDP the whole time. That's okay though. It'll take a while. So another risk is there's just no Psi liquidity on the public marketplaces. This could be for a variety of reasons. Exchanges have migrated over, so there's no Psi liquidity there. Potentially some Psi has been lost over time, lost private keys, sent to the wrong addresses, and so forth. And there's a very theoretical hoarding attack where an malicious attacker can just buy up all of the Psi, or as much Psi as they can, and just hold on to it, trying to resell it at a premium to CDP owners trying to close out their CDPs. And this could, I mean, if it's in the attack scenario, then certainly Psi price could balloon up. One option is to, I mean, if it's not a serious situation, certainly market makers can mint Psi to keep the price in line, and this can be facilitated by a lower stability fee. But this is probably a risk that everybody needs to be very cognizant of, because actually the only real defense against this is global settlement, and potentially a very early global settlement. It would essentially be an emergency of sorts. There's really there's no solution to, right? In fact, it's mathematically impossible for every CDP owner to migrate if there is Psi that is permanently out of circulation. And and additionally, if we're expecting market makers to mint Psi and sell into the increased price demand, then they need to be reassured that global settlement is a very real and very credible threat, or else we might find that our trusty market makers will no longer be willing to sell Psi, right? So to put some numbers on this, let's say someone has, for whatever reason, Psi has jumped to $1.03, $1.04. Naturally, the response over the past year has been to just lower the stability fee and have market makers mint more Psi. But that's presuming that market makers are confident that Psi will revert back to $1. And if this is an attack of sorts, then they may not have that reassurance. So yeah, when it comes to global settlement, I mean, of course, in normal situations, we've said all along that there's really no expectation that it gets triggered early, but the whole point of global settlement was to protect against attacks like this. And if there is ever a time that this action might be needed, I think the migration is certainly a justifiable cause, justifiable reason for this. Joe, do you have any thoughts here? Do you generally agree with this, or?
I agree with it completely. Yep. And there's nothing, I mean, this is, I think it should be, we should say we're not afraid to do it. If someone tries to pull that stunt. And, but I'm going to try to provide as much liquidity as people move over as possible. So
Cyrus, does that mean that there's a race condition for CDP owners migrating? That like basically the CDP owners that migrate last are kind of screwed?
I mean, let's put this in context first, right? The total amount of lost Psi is almost certainly less than 1%. If I had just, it really is. When it comes to exchange liquidity, Uniswap will always be around. I think Uniswap will kind of be the go-to source for anybody trying to find Psi. And the attack is itself, in my opinion, fairly unlikely. So technically there is a race condition. And so obviously we don't want, I mean, we urge people to migrate as soon as they get a chance. But yeah, global settlement is going to be called eventually, no matter what, right?
So just to be clear, just for myself, when the very last CDPs are there and they haven't migrated and there's no more Psi liquidity left and global settlement happens, they don't end up taking a haircut so long as there's no like slippage. They could just globally settle, withdraw the net amount of their CDPs in ETH, and then do what they will, right?
Right. They'll just get their balance of ETH back.
Got it.
Okay, moving on. We have to, obviously, the MCD ETH needs a debt ceiling, while the SCD also has a debt ceiling. And so if we were to just set the ETH debt ceiling to say 100 million to match SCD, then we've actually just doubled our entire available global debt ceiling, which is maybe not desirable, right? That debt ceiling needs to be there to facilitate the CDP migration. But if for whatever reason, new users come in and start borrowing a lot of DAI before CDP owners have migrated, well, now we've just created a whole bunch of new DAI and migration hasn't even happened, right? And if that happens, then obviously that new DAI needs to get absorbed by the market makers. Could be a bit of a supply issue there. Really all we can do is just start off with a smaller debt ceiling and raise accordingly, and then also reduce the side debt ceiling as the migration happens as well. Okay, just a couple more. Psi and DAI price below or above $1, just kind of general instability. This could happen because of secondary lending borrowers or CDP migration if there's no Psi liquidity. The DSR may also have an impact here since DSR is brand new. I think we're going to just have to react to this as it comes about and do our best with the stability fee. Definitely, I think we should have the option of increased governance calls, governance polls, executive votes, and so on. We should just be aware of that. Not sure if there's much to say here, honestly. We're just gonna have to monitor this as it happens and then just do what we do best. It hopefully shouldn't be too different than what we've been doing all year.
Do we want to come up with some sort of process for calling governance calls outside of the normal schedule?
Yeah, we do, and I'm going to leave that up to Rich to handle.
But yeah, no, I'm going to leave that up to the community and LongForWisdom. I'm just kidding. So this is where the major unknowns come into play, and I think I touched on this earlier, is that we don't know what a migration looks like. We have no way of predicting what the appetite is for the third-party lending ecosystem, the DAI holders, CDP holders, exchanges. There's so many different actors that need to come together. And depending on which of those stakeholder groups move faster than the other ones, we need to respond in different ways. So agility is going to be key. And as Cyrus pointed out, that might require us figuring out some mechanism of saying like, hey, everybody, it's time to have a chat, or it's time to look at the forum, or it's just time to check out the portal because there's a new poll. So yeah, we need to figure out what those processes look like.
Lastly, this is kind of a minor thing, but I just want it to be exhaustive, I guess, with the risks. So when MCD launches, Psi users can migrate over their Psi into DAI and lock it up in the DSR. The DSR is recorded as an accounting cost in the Maker protocol, and kind of like in the same bucket as bad debt would win, which is to the debt auctions, the MKR debt auctions. If no CDPs have migrated, then technically there's a chance that we trigger a debt auction early on for no real reason. It's just an annoying accounting thing. So I think we're going to just, and I guess we'll talk about this more when we eventually get to auction parameters, but we'll be starting off, I think we should start off with the higher threshold for MKR debt auctions.
So the initial threshold was proposed to be 10K, right?
Right.
So you what would be like your idea of a higher threshold?
I think maybe just 50K. I think we ran the numbers and we'll post them, but 50K should provide plenty of leeway in terms of preventing a early MKR debt auction. Yeah, this is kind of a weird one. It's really not a big deal, but
it basically only happens if the DSR that needs to be paid out is larger than the continuously accumulating stability fees from the new CDPs, right?
Right.
Yeah, so this happens, I guess, if we have lots of liquidity in the migration contract, but not many CDPs having swaps. Right.
Also, not all DAI will immediately be deposited into DSR. That's another consideration that kind of lowers the risk of this happening. Yeah, actually, the real reason I had this slide in was because I had thought that this would impact the 1 million MKR meme, because we would immediately dilute it. But I found out later on that because of the MKR that's already been burned, I think that should be going into, I think that the current SCD MKR stability fees, I think, will be burned after launch, I guess. And so this doesn't actually threaten the 1 million MKR. So now the real concern is just, do we care about triggering an early debt auction that doesn't need to happen from maybe a confidence perspective or something? I don't know. All right. To recap,
those were kind of a bunch of risks. I don't think very many of them were that serious, but I do think a couple of them are very serious. So this is kind of the general plan. Sane defaults, low DSR, stability fee, maybe 1 to 2% below the current one on MCD. And I think a debt ceiling of 50 million for ETH is fine. And as we reduce the SCD debt ceiling, which, I mean, pending community approval, we can then start to increase the ETH debt ceiling. And then just make sure we maintain a buffer in SCD for market makers, be prepared to trigger global settlement. Let's be on top of governance, and that's about it. Manage stability fee as best we can. Okay, so I did have a few more slides to talk about auctions and what the parameters might look like, but I don't think we'll get to that today. But yeah, this is just kind of a recap from last week's proposed risk parameters. And I guess we can talk about this in the forums or next week. And then, oh, right. One other thing is we are, obviously everything that's been presented here is kind of going into a document of sorts that kind of goes into a little bit more detail. And we will be putting this out for a governance poll for approval on the strategy. Hopefully, well, the document should go out in the next couple of days. And then I think the governance poll should hopefully go out next week, but I'll let Rich answer that.
Is that getting posted as a blog, or is it just going to be like a forum post with like the actual doc?
So certainly not a blog, but maybe a forum post.
Got it.
Yeah, the schedule is that's the document that we just saw a sneak peek of will go into the forums as a formal proposal. Maybe tomorrow, next day, certainly before Monday. On Monday, we have a poll to ratify the contents of that, and basically, as part of the migration strategy, that those same defaults will present a picture of what we're using to bootstrap MCD. So that will be largely the contents of the executive with all of the other attendant tweaks and feature sets that go out with it. But that is going to be the meat of what our launch will look like. So it's worth hitting up the forums and having a look at that post. All right, do we have any questions that need to be addressed? Compound stuff. I do not think so. We'll continue for the next half hour in a general Q&A session as time allows, but first we should do State of the Peg. So Vishesh, can you dazzle us with some graphs? Please.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, let me share my screen here. Okay, so starting off very simply with just what's been going on with DAI. So we saw that supply come up in the last few days to just shy of 90 million and then take a very slight dip. So this makes a fair amount of sense given like the context of, you know, ETH price first having dipped and then seeing a bit of a recovery and kind of holding. I think that gave a little bit of renewed confidence. And then in addition, just the tremendously cheap stability fee obviously contributes. So we saw, you know, a few very large draws, medium-sized draws right at like 2 days ago. And then a couple of small wipes in that same time frame. So net, a pretty decent increase in the supply, roughly 2 to 3 million. And then as far as collateral, just commensurately some moderate to low amounts of collateral added, which generally happens when more dye is drawn out. So that all makes perfect sense, just a slight uptick in outstanding supply. So to just kind of touch, we'll go to price actually real quick. So what's interesting is with that increase in supply, no real major dip in dye price. It's now sitting just slightly above $1, where it seems to like to sit nowadays. I think a lot of people are quite happy with that fact. Some people will argue that this should be depressed, but there's actually some interesting cases to consider why dye actually should naturally, especially moving into MCD and migration, have a little bit of an upward price pressure, which we can dive into if you want to discuss. But yeah, basically in the 7-day time frame, moderate to high volume trading volume, with price centered just slightly above $1 as well. So same sort of curve with a long tail as expected, and then basically same kind of expected distributions of the amount of that trading volume in different exchanges. So a huge chunk on Oasis, a decent amount on Coinbase. Interestingly enough, Kyber's been doing a fair amount of volume as well. And then Uniswap, and then Radar Relay, and some of the smaller exchanges. So I think all in all, this is a pretty positive indicator that things have been working well despite a pretty significant supply increase. So we can touch on secondary lending now. So essentially, what's been really interesting for me to watch is these borrow rates. So with the stability fee dropping from an already pretty comparatively low level of 14.5 to 12.5, 10.5, 9.5, and all the way down to 5.5, we saw the borrow rate on Compound moving very slightly from, say 12, 13% down to 11%. So not anywhere close to this stability fee. And it's very interesting and odd for me to see this huge buffer between these relative borrow rates. You would expect this to just trigger a tremendous amount of refinancings.
Yeah, so I have a quick
supply
question
rate,
about that. Do you think that people aren't refinancing back because there's no easy tool?
So there could be a number of reasons. One is to consider, well, actually, sorry, do you mind if I come back to that question?
Don't mind at all.
Okay. So to touch on volume then, so essentially what we've been seeing is those borrow volumes have not really moved at all. There was actually only a very slight dip and then even a very slight increase. So just net in that same time frame that there was a huge change in, or sorry, a moderately high change in outstanding supply, the borrow volumes on Compound did not move much at all. So that's really interesting. Is you would have expected, or I would have expected, a very large dip in these borrow volumes with the drop in the stability fee, again, for refinancing. And then potentially, a slight recovery with the increase in outstanding supply. But honestly, if the stability fee is that much lower and you have additional volume being taken out on Maker, there's really no reason for that to refinance back over to a higher borrow rate on Compound. So really would have just expected that to sit on Maker and then to really not move at all and then maybe slightly dip. So that's very interesting. And then with the supply volumes, essentially a slight increase with that increase in supply, but really not a huge change. So this is just fascinatingly quiet. You would have expected a larger disruption. So yeah, a slight uptick in utilization rate commensurately, which makes sense given what we just talked about with borrow and supply. And then here, sorry, a slight uptick in cash because there's more supply and borrow is not much changed. And then utilization is a slight dip. So this is actually a very low, sort of all-time low utilization rate for DAI on Compound. And then DYDX has kind of been fluctuating all about, but still sitting in the 70s range. So yeah, to come back to talking about these volumes is most interesting to answer David's question. So essentially, one important leg, I think, of this equation that we've seen over time is user interface and the bridges that exist for refinancing. But it's also interesting to consider the potential that the DAI that is being borrowed on Compound is being borrowed either at different risk profiles or using different assets as collateral. And so the question really there is, how many points of an annual interest rate are borrowers willing to eat in opportunity cost versus having to exchange the assets that they're using collateral, unwind their positions, switch over to using ETH as collateral, and then refinance to Maker. So in the event that those traders are, for example, collateralizing with, I don't know, USDC, then it's possible that it's not worth those few points for them to go and exchange that collateral asset for a different collateral asset and refinance over to Maker. Or alternatively, there may be traders that are, being lazy, not deciding to switch, waiting for user interface issues, etc. Hard to predict when people do things that are against economic incentives, why they are doing them. But the other potential case is as a bit of a holdout on rates if there's an expectation of those rates changing, or if for some reason they're more comfortable using Compound than Maker with something to do with migration or MCD. Again, hard to predict some of those behaviors that flow counter to what the incentives are, but I think we can agree that these behaviors appear to be counter to what the incentives are. I do think the most likely explanation is that these are users that are either highly levered and interested in taking advantage of that lower collateral requirement, and so a few points less in an annual interest rate doesn't really make a huge difference to them, or the alternative explanation being that they're using a different collateral asset, and again, those few points are not worth them unwinding their position, going through the cost of exchanging those assets, and then refinancing over to Maker. Those are, in my opinion, the two most likely explanations, but again, it's very hard to guess as to people's motivations. Okay, I will stop sharing there and see if there are more questions.
I had a question. It's kind of maybe more aimed at Cyrus than you, but so we've got like 2 weeks until, well, approximately 2 weeks until MCD, right? So we've got 2 more cycles of voting on stability fee changes. If we vote to reduce the fee again, seeing as we're still above PEG and we moved 4% last time, is there a plan for MCD launch where if the SCD stability fee is at like 0.5% or like 2% or something, if it's already like really low?
So I do think that question is better targeted towards Cyrus. I will say one thing implicit in your question, though, is that we should continually lower the stability fee to chase the peg being slightly above $1. And my point earlier was the way things are currently, it may actually be a natural equilibrium point for DAI to be slightly above $1. And I would probably discourage against trying to continually chase that extra 0.01% by continually lowering the stability fee. And I don't imagine that that's the smartest reasoning for the continual lowering of the stability fee. It's just that in general, people will try to manage down those costs when the system is willing to bear it. I mean, I think the system is willing to bear it right now, but I don't think it's necessarily about chasing that extra 0.01% on the peg.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'm, I guess, worried that will happen anyway.
Fair.
To answer your question, so yeah, if the SCD stability fee is super low and the MCD fee can't be lowered anymore, then Rich will personally go out and pay every single CDP owner out of his pocket to convince them to migrate, so he doesn't have to manage two ecosystems.
As long as people present their receipts, operators are standing by. Customer support champions.
But Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a very clear solution for that, right? I think the overall goal of the migration plan has been to absolutely minimize any amount of engineering, like financial engineering on the community's end to kind of pull at strings to get people to migrate. It's been designed to be very amenable to all of the various stakeholders in the ecosystem. What I think what you're basically asking is, what happens if people just aren't migrating for an extended period of time? And there are a number of ideas that are probably not very palatable. So you could increase the SCD stability fee, although that would penalize users. You could actually do all sorts of things. So I think if we're veering into the area of going that extra step, I think we should at least have the discussion of global settlement at that point versus forcing people to migrate. And I mean, it depends on our objective, right? In terms of where we are in the migration stage and all that kind of
It's
stuff.
a tough one. There's a lot of what ifs, and we don't know what migration is going to look like. So, sane defaults, trying to remain as responsive as possible, and seeing the way that the ecosystem moves and responding to it is going to be the order of the day, I think. Unsatisfying response. It'd be nice if there's an algorithm that would save us, but we have yet to determine what that algorithm is. 50 minutes after the hour, we have 50 minutes left. LongForWisdom, can you take us through governance at a glance and let us know what's been happening in the forums?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's been fairly quiet. I think the most notable thing was a discussion on the purity die thread, which was kind of related to what we were just talking about, which was specifically related to sort of questioning why we can't leave SCD open indefinitely and not like aim for shutdown in like a couple months, right? I think that was probably the most significant thing.
I mean, was it answered in the thread, or is this something we should discuss on the call?
Potentially something we should discuss. I don't. So the user in question was asking if there was any technical reason why that couldn't happen, which I think is the answer is no. But obviously, a couple of people listed the non-technical reasons that like it massively increases the scope of governance and other.
Yeah, it definitely increases the scope of governance. Also, I mean, SCD is just not as safe as MCD for a variety of reasons in terms of the new security modules that are being put in place. So I just think it's a risk to have a less secure, less monitored system to operate. But I mean, I guess really that's a question for the MKR community, right? They can just reject global settlement every time the vote for it were to come up. If they really want to self-organize or coordinate or keep it alive, they certainly could. As long as they're aware of the risks, right?
I guess it'd be good to get some idea. Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. I think that there's obviously a camp that would love to see DAI sort of be right in the coattails of Ethereum exclusively and live and die based on the success of that ecosystem. But I think there's probably a lot of interesting things are going to happen in the next year or two. So I think that there's room to have have your cake and eat it too, potentially with MCD. How that would look. There's posts in the forums already. I think somebody just posted the purity die thing, which desperately needs a better name than that. But there's some mechanisms in place. I'm becoming increasingly convinced, though, that the community itself is going to initiate a global settlement sooner than we probably expected, because there are significant risks to the ecosystem and to DAI holders and to the DeFi space with sort of poorly supported, potentially unstable, low liquidity version of DAI hanging around. So I think that there's all kinds of reasons, not even getting into the operational and governance and risk overhead that we'd all have to bear. We're all going to bear in the next whatever foreseeable future, maintaining basically two ecosystems. And this is something that I talked about a couple of calls ago. And we still need to make sure we internalize this. We're heading into a world where all the stuff that we've been doing up until now, double it and potentially triple it. And that's the world that we live in. So how long are we going to be willing to shoulder that kind of additional work and confusion is going to be a big question. So there's going to be all kinds of pressures, but like I said, I'd be surprised if the community wasn't the ones agitating for governance, global settlement sooner rather than later. That's just my magic 8-ball talking though. I don't know.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. It looks like the majority of the community. It's hard as it is to tell. It's in favor of leaving. So.
I think it's part of that cognitive dissonance I was talking about, where people, as we become more popular, people are discovering and or realizing that they haven't scratched the surface of what MakerDAO is. So they do a couple scratches and they realize that what we've been up to for the last 4 years doesn't match up with their mental model. And so there's an adjustment period of hot takes and really annoying Twitter threads that they need to get out of their system, and then slowly acclimating themselves to what is actually happening here. So yeah, I'm not sure that supporting single collateral DAI in perpetuity is a job that anybody really wants. But we'll see how it goes. It's not up to us. All right, I think that we just hit the awkward silence points. I think we can all just stare at each other for maybe 25 seconds and see if there's another question that pops up. But David, did you snap already?
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think you could last 25 seconds.
I don't have to now. Oh, starting now. Every time you offer another suggestion, the timer resets. What if I just mute myself and you guys can't see me visibly sweating? All right. So yeah, let's leave it there for a second. This is a perfect opportunity. Like there's no question. Well, I should say that there are dumb questions in this world. But if you ask a dumb question, we won't call you out. So if there's anything you want to know, it doesn't have to be specifically related to things we just spoke about. Just MakerDAO in general, recent events, things like that. Feel free to type a question in the chat or speak up on the mic. I can't do it. I'm gonna snap. Otherwise, please join us in the forums or in subreddit. We still poke our heads in there every once in a while, but forums are where the governance actually happens. So looking forward to seeing some activity related to people responding to Cyrus's migration plan. Looking forward to Patrick's thread on how we can fix skin in the game, how we can fix plutocracies and apathy. That's going to be super interesting. And I think we'll leave it there. Look forward to our polls next week. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for all the great input.